Thank you for plugging into this Family Life News podcast, streaming issues-driven, family-focused news. And welcome to a special edition of Capital Connection. This is our year in review special report. We're counting down the top 5 stories of 2020, and what a year it has been. So what were the issues and the events that mattered most in New York and Pennsylvania? Who better to ask than the Capital Connection crew? They are Jason McGuire and Michael Geer. And gentlemen, welcome to the program. Hard to believe the year is almost over. I don't think either of you are going to be missing it too much. But Michael, let's start with you. The 5 biggest stories from New York and Pennsylvania. What did you have, sir, and why?
Well, one of the biggest ones was obviously Pennsylvania being a swing state, and the focus of the election on Pennsylvania, especially with the Trump rallies that happened in our state, setting records with crowds. The largest one, I think, 57,000 in Butler, Pennsylvania. Sometimes President Trump doing 3 or even 4 rallies across our state. That, I think, set a precedent for what we've seen in Pennsylvania in comparison to what would be described as President-elect Biden visits to Pennsylvania were few and far between and very sparsely attended. Typically, he would just come across the border from Delaware into Pennsylvania to Philadelphia to do those gatherings, typically people sitting in their cars. But those rallies in Pennsylvania being a swing state was a big story in 2020.
And it was almost on a daily basis, too. And that I had that as my 5th biggest story of the year as well, the Trump-Biden rallies in the critical battleground state. Jason, what was your 5th biggest story of the year?
My 5th biggest story is one that's still unfolding, and that's the congressional race in New York 22. I mean, to think that a congressional race with those tens of thousands of ballots representing hundreds of thousands of constituents is coming down to 12 ballots, battling back and forth, ballots that are found in drawers months after the election. This is a story that's still unfolding, but I think it's a story that's going to play out in 2021 as we head to the courts, is what will happen in that race between Claudia Tenney and Mr. Brindisi in New York 22.
Very interesting. I had the Dem supermajority in Albany this year and what that might mean for legislation going forward as my 5th biggest story. Counting down 5-1, the biggest news events from Albany and Harrisburg with the Capital Connection crew. Jason, we'll start with you on this one. Your 4th biggest story of 2020.
Well, Bob, your 5th biggest story is my 4th biggest story. I'm taking a look at what happened in the state Senate this year, the rise of the Senate Democratic supermajority, and not just the Senate, but also the Assembly. And there's a progressive wing now in Albany that's probably going to dictate the agenda for at least the next couple of cycles.
All right, huge story indeed. And in Harrisburg, Michael, number 4 on your list.
Well, I think it's a national story that had significant implications in Pennsylvania with the George Floyd killing in Minneapolis, leading to riots in that city, but then spreading to other places, including Philadelphia here in Pennsylvania, but rioting, looting. What has happened since then, massive increases in crimes, and Philadelphia is facing what looks to be the 3rd highest homicide rate in the 60 years it's been measured. Difficult future coming forward in 2021 in places like Philadelphia.
Yeah, I had the 4th biggest story in PA, Act 77 in action, the impact of early voting this year, and I'm sure we'll be talking more about that with you, Michael. But in the meantime, 2 down, 3 to go. The 3rd biggest news event in Pennsylvania this year. Michael, what did you have?
Well, I would say it's the actions of our governor, and basically that has to do with the COVID shutdowns and things, and sort of the grasp and embrace of power, shutting out the legislature in its efforts to try to partner with the governor and how the COVID crisis is going to be handled in our state. He's vetoed significant numbers of bills that the legislature sent to him to allow a partnership in how to deal with the COVID crisis, and terrible what happened there.
Yeah, it's not even an impacted Governor Wolf. He got infected. We don't know if Governor Cuomo was infected or not, but a lot of other people in New York was. Jason, I had COVID in New York, killing 35,000 people as my 3rd biggest story of the year. What was yours, Jason McGuire?
Yeah, it seems like all these stories are related, and I'm just going to refer to it as the Cuomo press conferences. The rise of Andrew Cuomo as a national figure again. I think the governor saw that during this COVID COVID crisis and the pandemic, he had an opportunity to seize the attention of not only New York but the nation, and held daily press conferences, quite lengthy ones, that were covered. It led to his receiving an Emmy for his leadership during the pandemic, of all things. And I think that was the biggest story for me for number 3 here in New York, is watching what has happened with Andrew Cuomo, and an interest now that we're going into what's being called a second wave, to see him try to bring back the press conferences, but not to have the press in the room, to do it through Zoom. It seems like there was a little backfire effect this time around. I think it's frustrating the governor.
Yeah.
But the Cuomo press conferences are number 3.
That was a huge story as well. And we've got 3 down, 2 to go. The top 2 news events of 2020 in New York and Pennsylvania. I had the nursing home deaths, Jason, in New York. What a story that was. They gave the governor an Emmy for his press conferences, but this did not bode well for Governor Cuomo, and the impact of that story this year, you cannot overstate it. But be interesting to find out what your second biggest story of the year was.
That is my biggest story of the year, is the nursing home deaths and the homes, the group homes, people with developmental disabilities and others. To watch the governor that has tried to manage this so tightly, to watch that issue get away, and we still don't know the numbers on the nursing home deaths in New York. The state continues to block the real number behind those deaths. And so there are people that are impacted by this, not only through the deaths that have occurred in the nursing homes, but it has also had an impact on families to this day that cannot visit their loved ones there. And that continues to be a story, that these people are being left alone in these homes around the state. That's my second biggest story of 2020.
Second biggest story in Pennsylvania this year, Michael.
The second biggest story in our state really starts in October of 2019 when Act 77 passed. You mentioned that before, but that created election controversy in our state that has continued right up until this date and going into January, with court cases still pending on a state Senate race in Western Pennsylvania, the presidential race obviously in uproar as a result of what happened with mail-in ballots and vote counting and what machines are being used. So many of those different things make election issues in Pennsylvania one of the biggest, number 2 story for us here, I would say, in 2020. And going forward, it's going to be something we need to look at.
Yeah, and you said back on election night, Michael, you asked a question, is Pennsylvania the Florida from 2000? You all remember hanging dimpled and pregnant chads. This one more to do with early voting, and why in the wide world of sports did everything shut down at 10:30 at night and not open up again until the next morning? That is a question we're still looking to get answers to, and I as well had that as the second biggest story of the year. Okay, here we go. Top story of 2020 in New York and Pennsylvania. Michael, we'll start with you.
Well, I think the big one would say that God has sustained us through 2020. This has been one of the most challenging years that people would say on record, whether it's the impact of COVID with the severe sickness and deaths that has come from that, or the economic impacts of COVID that have happened as well, with school shutdowns and holidays being, we're being told don't visit people, being shut out of visiting the elderly in nursing homes, and yet God remains on the throne, and we can trust in Him even in these challenging times. And I think it's a time that many families have, in spite of these challenges, come together. People have recognized the value of churches, the value of community, and we cherish that, I think, even more. And that would be a good thing in a very difficult year.
Very difficult indeed. And Jason, ring the bell. You're the final one. Let's put a bow on this package for our listeners and give us your top story of 2020.
Well, I guess these minds are thinking alike, because I see a sovereign God who sustained us through these state shutdowns. This has been a very challenging year for New York as well. And, in the Empire State, we were the first state to see this statewide shutdown. And it may be in January we're heading back in that direction if you listen to the governor's comments. And yet through it all, we continue to see how God has sustained us as an organization, how He has led to even a Supreme Court ruling that has peeled back the religious gathering restrictions and allowing churches to meet again. That was a huge move in the Supreme Court. And we're just watching that God has seen us through this. Studies are even showing that people that are engaged in their church are weathering COVID-19 better than those that are not. And so what a great opportunity to have evangelism on our minds as we head into 2021.
Well, guys, this will be the last time we speak in 2020. testimony, and I just want to say what a blessing you both are to me, and what a blessing you are to this ministry to be able to showcase you every week. But before we go, folks may not know that you're both not-for-profits, and it's not cheap to do what you do. And this is the time of year when people look to make year-end contributions. I'm sure both of you would appreciate it if folks would stand with you financially. Jason, let's begin with you. Where can folks find out more about New Yorkers for Constitutional Freedoms?
NewYorkFamilies.org.
And how can folks give to the great work going on at the Pennsylvania Family Institute, Michael?
That'd be pafamily.org/donate.